Metro TV.
Recording in progress.
We're good. The recording has started.
Good evening and welcome to the August 27th, 2024 Eugene Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Jason Lear and I'm Vice Chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. To begin this evening, I'd like to call on Commissioner Fragola for the city's land acknowledgement statement.
I do not have that available to me at the moment.
Alyssa, you think we could circulate that, or what do you want to do? Skip it?
I mean, I know it's in the AIS. I just am having technical difficulties with the computer right now.
Are you able to read it, or should we have someone else read it?
Can we show it on the screen? Can we share it on the screen?
Yeah. Crystal, do you have it at your fingertips? If not, I can send it to you.
Yes, I can grab it here in just a moment. So let me find it. Okay. Maybe try to make it a little bigger before I share. Here we go. Thank you for your patience. One sec. Here we go.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So since time immemorial, the Kalapuya people have been the indigenous stewards to our region, building dynamic communities, maintaining balance with wildlife, and enacting sustainable land practices. This land acknowledgement is a way of resisting the erasure of indigenous histories and to honor Native communities by inviting truth and reconciliation. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. As we consider the impacts of colonization, we also acknowledge the strength and resiliency of displaced indigenous people. The city of Eugene is built within the traditional homelands known as Kalapuya Ilihi. Kalapuya descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. They continue to make contributions in our communities here and across the lands. We express our respect for the inherent political sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations and indigenous people who live in the state of Oregon and across the nation. Therefore, the Planning Commission recognizes that what we do today will affect the many generations who will come after us.
Thank you, Commissioner Fragola, and for this is from Crystal. Thank you to everyone joining us in this virtual meeting format. Today, our meeting will begin with public comment, followed by work sessions on climate-friendly areas. Anyone wishing to join the meeting online can do so by following the instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. Planning Commission meetings can also be viewed by watching the live stream available on our website or the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21. For those who join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting and haven't done so already, please raise your virtual hand now to join the speaker's queue in one of two ways. For those viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or device, click once on the blue hand icon. For those listening to the meeting on a phone, press *9. Public comment is an opportunity for individuals to speak to the Planning Commission on any topics except for items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record is already closed. As a reminder, your hand must be raised in the queue for the public comment. And it sounds like we might have a public comment.
Yeah, looks like we have one person in the queue.
Turn it over to you, Crystal.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Crystal Fisher. The Planning Commission has allotted a maximum of 10 minutes for public comment this evening. To ensure anyone wishing to speak has an adequate opportunity to do so, each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes. We will announce whose turn it is to provide public comment, as well as who is up next. When your name is announced for public comment, we will enable the Allow to Speak function, which will allow you to unmute, but will not allow for video. Please do not unmute until it is your turn for public comment. When your public comment is concluded, your microphone will be muted. Please note that use of profanity is prohibited, and any instances of profanity will result in the immediate termination of speaking privileges. With these instructions out of the way, Danielle will be our first public commenter tonight. We do not have anyone else in the queue at this time. Danielle, I am allowing you to talk now.
Hi, I'm Janelle Carlson, and I live at the community supported shelters, the end of Washington Street. And I'm just trying to figure out, where can the homeless people go? You know, they're being swept every day. Their stuff's being taken. Most of them don't even get their stuff back. You know, it's actually, in reality, almost it's being stolen, basically. That's, if you look at it, it is being stolen, because they're not getting their belongings back. It's being thrown away, or they don't know where it's at. You know, they're told they can't be here. Okay, well, where can they be? Where can we be? Just because I live in a hut, I don't forget where I came from. We are all human beings, and the cops have been heard saying that they're NHI, which is non-human involved. Bull. We're humans. We're humans, and we deserve to be treated like humans. Regardless of whether we're homeless or not, we all are trying to survive. You know, I got into a hut. I bettered myself. That's all people need, is a place to go. So can we get some help here? That's all I'm fighting for, is to get some help. And I have no problems with putting myself out there to help with ideas or to help with whatever. But we need some help. This isn't fair. It's every day. And they're being, the cops have been videoed of being brutal, assaultive, rude, disrespectful. I mean, their tents being ruined. And then the cops turn around and leave. Well, what are they supposed to stay in after they do that? People are being treated like trash. And I'm sorry, but we're not trash. We all bleed just like everybody else. Just because somebody has a home doesn't make them any better than somebody that doesn't. That's all I got.
You do have just under a minute remaining.
That's all I got for right now.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your comments. As always, feel free to contact staff if there are comments you were not able to provide or wish to get to us in a different manner. And we'll now close public comment. Do any members of the commission want to respond to public comment? Moving on to our next agenda item, I'd like to turn it over to Leah Rausch to begin the staff presentation. Following the staff presentation, the commission will have the opportunity to ask questions. If you'd like to ask a quick question to clarify something during the presentation, that's okay. We're going to try to save substantive questions for after the presentation.
Okay.
Leah?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Lear. Thank you, commissioners, and good evening. My name is Leah Rausch. I'm a senior planner on the community planning and design team. And I will be kicking us off tonight. I am going to go ahead and share my presentation. Okay. We, as Commissioner Lear said, have a pretty meaty presentation for you. So hopefully it will be interesting, but we'll try and save our questions here for the end. I'm joined tonight by Stuart Warren, who's another planner on the team. He'll talk a little bit later. And then Becky Hewitt from Echo Northwest is with us tonight. We'll be presenting on the results of a redevelopment analysis. So we're happy to have her here. As you all have heard from me before, Eugene has started back in 2022 a multi-year effort to advance our goals regarding climate action, housing production, and transportation through a state-directed program called Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities, or CFEC. The CFEC rules are intended to guide how cities will meet our climate action goals, or the state's climate action goals rather, through changes to local transportation and housing planning systems. Tonight's work session is going to be focused on our implementation of the climate-friendly areas component of the state's CFEC rules. Eugene is required to adopt regulations facilitating walkable mixed-use development in designated climate-friendly areas, or CFAs, within urban growth boundaries. Given the intertwining goals between our ongoing urban growth planning and the CFAC requirements, in Eugene, we'll kind of integrate climate-friendly areas designation within the Urban Growth Strategies project. And we hope this leads to a more cohesive approach to housing and urban growth planning. As you'll recall, Urban Growth Strategies is a multi-year project to identify the tools, actions, policies, and land needed for the next 20 years to support housing and living wage jobs in Eugene. So just our agenda tonight, I'll start with a super quick refresher on how climate-friendly areas fit into our urban growth strategies work, including the policy work in Eugene's comprehensive plan supporting mixed-use centers, which Stuart will touch on in more detail. Then we'll talk in more detail about climate-friendly areas, and Becky from Echo Northwest will join us to talk about the results of a redevelopment analysis supporting CFA selection. After that, I'll briefly share with you all the 3 staff proposed CFA options. And today we're looking for your feedback on these options, and then we'll be coming back to you in October for your recommendation to council. As I said, we have a lot of presentation tonight, but we're hoping to leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. So as you'll recall, there are 3 phases to the urban growth strategies work, including to identify Eugene's needs and priorities for housing, as we've already heard a little bit about tonight, to study what land is needed for housing, jobs, parks, schools, and infrastructure, and then using what was learned to create and update the regulations, guidelines, and maps for using land in Eugene. Climate-friendly areas work is most directly integrated into 2 of these phases, which I'll highlight briefly. That first phase is to identify and document our community's needs and priorities for housing. The housing production strategy will summarize and prioritize tools and actions to address our housing needs. After adoption in 2026, the housing production strategy will be an 8-year adopted city work plan. It's quite possible that the housing production strategy will include incentives or other tools to encourage more housing in mixed-use centers and along key corridors, including climate-friendly areas. In the shorter term, we'll identify a handful of tools to adopt right away. These are our land use efficiency measures. These are tools that use residential and employment lands more efficiently, allowing or encouraging more housing and jobs on land than previously expected. Climate-friendly areas designation will be one of our efficiency measures. The housing production strategy and urban growth strategies more broadly will be heavily impacted by ongoing state rulemaking as a part of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. We are closely tracking that work at the state level, commenting on the draft rules, and monitoring any possible impacts on our project timeline. Ultimately, we want to prioritize the work that will make more immediate impacts, including the actions in the housing production strategy and our land use efficiency measures. The third phase of this work is focused on the citywide policies that will implement urban growth strategies work and other city priorities, primarily through the development of the next phase of our Eugene-specific comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan implements the vision outlined in Envision Eugene and will be supported by new community input. Updates will include new chapters on housing, compact development and urban design, community health, public facilities and services, and community engagement. Another key component of the comprehensive plan is the Eugene-specific land use designation map, which is a parcel-specific map that will clarify and define land use designations and policies for the land within Eugene's urban growth boundary. We expect that climate-friendly areas will be implemented in several places in the comprehensive plan, including policies in the compact development, housing, and community health chapters, as well as through a land use designation overlay. Importantly, the comprehensive plan will also include a citywide policy framework to focus future growth and investment in and near mixed-use centers and corridors. This framework is more broad than climate-friendly areas and is responsive to Eugene's unique community needs and years of community engagement, most recently through Envision Eugene. I'll hand it off to Stuart to talk a little bit more about that framework.
Thank you, Leah, and good evening, commissioners. My portion of tonight's presentation will cover current efforts to focus future growth and investment in and near mixed-use centers. The City of Eugene has a long history of planning for mixed-use centers by intentionally connecting land use and transportation planning. Through this approach, the city can better connect the infrastructure needed to get people to the places they want to go efficiently and without having to rely on a car. By keeping goods and services close together and near housing, Eugene can continue to improve access for those who need it most while making progress towards our climate goals. Policies for mixed-use centers will be included in the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan chapters. Later in the presentation, Leah is going to talk more about climate-friendly areas. Climate-friendly area designation is a specific regulatory tool that would be most appropriate for the downtown center and some core commercial centers, because climate-friendly area requirements have a lot in common with both of those areas. I want to highlight upfront that is neither expected nor appropriate for all identified mixed-use centers to be designated as climate-friendly areas. Eugene's community vision calls for focusing future growth and investment in and near mixed-use centers to increase access to essential goods and services for all residents. Mixed-use centers provide convenient access to daily needs such as housing, jobs, groceries, parks, schools, and services, as well as providing opportunities for social connection. Mixed-use centers are envisioned to be convenient and potentially climate-friendly. They bring goods and services closer to where people live without having to rely on a car. Centers are connected, meaning that they are planned for high-quality infrastructure for people who walk, bike, take the bus, and drive. Centers are comfortable and safe, meaning that they contain things like trees and comfortable spaces for people to socialize. And lastly, centers range in size and activity level. The city is planning for 3 different types of centers. They are the downtown center, core commercial center, and neighborhood centers. I'm going to go into more detail about each of these types of centers in the next few slides. The downtown center is the largest and most active of all the centers. It has vertical housing that transitions to smaller buildings on the edges. Some buildings in the downtown center can be up to 150 tall in C3 zoned areas, or about 12 stories. Downtown is the hub for uses like regional employment, government services, arts and tourism, and the main entertainment hub in Eugene. Downtown has high quality infrastructure for people who walk, bike, take the bus, and drive. Core commercial centers are located throughout Eugene on key corridors and are smaller than downtown. Examples of areas like core commercial areas are Lower Coburg Road or the Fred Meyer Shopping Center on River Road near Beltline Highway. They have mid-rise apartments, row houses, and middle housing types. They're generally surrounded by lots of housing, but some of them have housing right in the center. Buildings in C2 zoned areas are allowed to be up to about 120 feet, which is about 10 stories, but most will be mid-rise, so about 5 to 6 stories or 65 feet. Core commercial centers contain uses like professional services, office, retail, dining, and grocery stores. They're also planned for high quality infrastructure for people who walk, bike, take the bus, and drive. Neighborhood centers are the smallest type of center and are located throughout Eugene. Examples of neighborhood centers are the core commercial center or area kind of near the Red Barn in the Whitaker or the Friendly Area Market. They have mid-rise apartments, row houses, middle housing types, and detached housing around the edges. Buildings in neighborhood centers can be up to about 4 stories tall. Neighborhood centers are your small neighborhood place to access like retail, dining services, and your favorite down the street cafe or watering hole. They are also planned for high quality pedestrian infrastructure and have slow, quiet streets. Next steps for centers include analyzing and synthesizing the results of the last 6 months of engagement. The image to the right is our initial analysis of the online mapping activity that asks people about the places they go or they wish they could go close to home. The circles represent places where people reported they're going, and the diamonds represent places people wish they could go. This is just a little teaser of us going to come to you at our next meeting. Then, using what we've learned through that community engagement, we're going to, along with other technical analysis, staff will start drafting goals and policies related to centers in the compact development, housing, and community health chapters of the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan. And with that, I'd like to pass the presentation back over to Leah.
Awesome, thank you, Stuart. Okay, so with that kind of framework in mind, and as Stuart said, we don't expect all of Eugene's centers to be designated climate-friendly areas, and he gave that great example around neighborhood centers. That's because climate-friendly areas are a pretty specific regulatory type of center that's directed by state administrative rule. And they're intended to play an important role in reducing our dependence on cars, lowering household transportation costs, and decreasing pollution by keeping goods and services close together and near housing. I'm going to do a quick refresher on the CFA requirements and the CFA study, but later on we'll discuss 3 proposed options for CFA designation to get your feedback. So what is a CFA? As a reminder, a climate-friendly area is intended to be an area where most people can meet their daily needs without relying on a car. They're envisioned as one type of mixed-use center with the highest density housing, jobs, and services, as well as great walking, biking, and transit infrastructure. By designating a CFA, Eugene will update our housing and transportation plans for these areas to have opportunities for increased mixed-use development with a focus on housing and non-auto-oriented commercial and public uses, identified and prioritized improvements that make it easier and safer for people to walk, bike, and take transit to their destinations, and implemented strategies to avoid or minimize displacement of residents that are vulnerable to housing instability or housing discrimination, as well as to preserve and increase affordable housing options. Our process to designate climate-friendly areas has 3 steps. First was the study. So in 2023, Eugene identified and studied the most promising locations for climate-friendly areas across the city. This included an analysis of key state evaluation criteria, which I'll talk through in more detail. It also included development of a community engagement approach and a displacement risk analysis. The second step, where we are now, is selection and then adoption. This year, we'll work to select our CFAs, and that process will include community engagement, a recommendation from the Planning Commission, and direction from City Council. Then we can begin the process to adopt CFAs through amendments to the Land Use Code, the Comprehensive Plan, and possibly our Transportation System Plan, or TSP. Finally, we'll monitor and potentially increase CFAs. So the designation isn't intended to be static. And as I mentioned, as a land use efficiency measure, CFAs will serve as an important strategy for more efficient use of land within the current urban growth boundary. Each time we revisit the urban growth boundary, now every 8 years for our housing needs, we'll also revisit our designated climate-friendly areas. We'll be required to maintain a threshold of zoned capacity for at least 30% of Eugene's current and future housing needs within climate-friendly areas. Our first stage of analysis in the climate-friendly areas study was a citywide scan of all potential locations using 4 key criteria. So we looked at existing or planned urban centers, accessible via high-quality transit, places where development isn't restricted or prohibited by hazards or natural disasters, and within the urban growth boundary. So I'll just highlight 2 of those that I think are most important for the study. In red, you'll see our existing or planned urban centers. So places like downtown, our core commercial centers, and our key corridors. Staff chose to define existing and planned urban centers in terms of zoning. So we use 13 base zones and special area zones that are in closer alignment to our CFA criteria. In purple, you'll see places that are accessible via high quality transit. Staff defined high quality transit access as a half-mile walkable distance from a transit corridor. It's important to note that this approach limits the definition to current service rather than considering planned service improvements. We then narrowed those areas further based on some additional requirements related to the minimum width or size of climate-friendly areas. So after those first 2 stages of narrowing, we have 9 suitable areas. And as you can see, there's a great deal of alignment with these areas and our community vision for key transit corridors and core commercial centers. Additionally, the study looks at how well those places could meet the state's other criteria for climate-friendly areas. So we considered things like zoning and development regulations. Is the area planned as a high-density mixed-use urban center? And could the existing development regulations comply with the state rules with relatively few changes? Looked at capacity for current and future housing. So as I mentioned, we're required to have the capacity for 30% or more of our current and future housing need within climate-friendly areas, and to maintain that moving forward. Parks and public amenities. So does the area have, or is it near sufficient parks and other public amenities? Would it be appropriate to site facilities providing public services within the area? High quality active transportation, and as I mentioned, transit. Is the area served or planned to be served by high quality walking, biking, and transit facility? And in figuring that out, we worked closely with the city's transportation planners and LTD to understand current and planned facilities and services. And this area is, of course, a major priority for climate-friendly areas as a part of more intentionally integrating land use and transportation planning. We looked at adequate infrastructure. So can the area's electricity, stormwater, water, and wastewater infrastructure support the land use requirements for climate-friendly areas? Development and redevelopment conditions. So can the area support the types of development intended for climate-friendly areas, which is typically high-density residential and mixed-use development? And of course, Becky will talk about this more in a moment. And then finally, housing displacement risk. So what is the relative risk of housing displacement of underserved communities, and how can the city mitigate that displacement risk? This element will really be more fully addressed in our housing production strategy. So briefly, I'll just dig into one of those criteria more deeply, looking at the changes needed to bring zoning, current zoning, and development regulations into compliance with CFA requirements. So we focused our analysis on a few key components of the development regulations for CFAs. First was outright permitted uses. So CFAs must allow both single use and mixed use developments, as well as certain outright permitted uses, including multi-unit housing and attached single unit residential or row homes, office type uses, non-auto dependent retail services and other commercial uses, childcare, schools, and other public uses, including public serving government facilities. And so for the purposes of our evaluation in the CFA study, any development that requires approval through a land use application process, such as site review or planned unit development or a conditional use permit, that would not be considered kind of outright permitted. The other most relevant development standards relate to minimum densities and building heights. The study relies on the prescriptive development standards presented in the CFAC rules, which require and encourage the following CFA designations. So we must designate at least one primary CFA with a minimum residential density of 25 dwelling units per net acre and a maximum building height of no less than 85 feet throughout. We have the option to designate secondary CFAs, which would need a minimum residential density of 15 dwelling units per net acre and a maximum building height of no less than 50 feet throughout. In short, that analysis showed our existing higher intensity commercial zones, which are C2 and C3, are the most compliant with CFA standards. The big changes in C2 and C3 would be introducing minimum residential densities and making sure the listed uses are outright permitted. In some places, they are affected by site review and planned unit development overlays. I'll just note that both R3 and R4, which is our limited and high density residential areas, are less compliant than these commercial zones, mostly because of the outright permitted uses. To be a CFA compliant, these zones would need to allow office type uses, non-auto oriented commercial and retail services, schools, and childcare facilities. Additionally, R3 has some height limitation areas, which would require an increase in maximum allowable building heights. And finally, both zones would need to increase minimum residential densities and remove existing maximum residential densities. The second criteria, as you know, that we wanted to dig into a little bit further is the potential for redevelopment in these suitable areas. So when we talk about redevelopment, we're talking about tearing down existing development and replacing it with development that has greater capacity. We contracted with Echo Northwest to complete a study of market feasible redevelopment, and I'll hand it off to Becky in just a moment here to talk through the redevelopment analysis in a lot more detail. But briefly, the purpose of the analysis is to evaluate redevelopment potential in our selected study areas, to understand the needed financial incentives to encourage higher density mixed use and housing development, and to test a range of development types across a range of local markets and rents. So starting from our suitable climate-friendly areas, we wanted to identify the most appropriate study areas to analyze here. So this is another map showing kind of how we narrowed that down. So we included most of the 9 suitable areas in the CFA study with a few modifications, including we removed any areas that were less compatible with CFA designation or would require more significant regulatory changes. So we removed the Whitaker neighborhood, an area out on very far West 11th, and then some other smaller areas kind of in the core that were less compliant based on their current zoning. We removed 3 areas that are already kind of being redeveloped under current conditions, or they have kind of particular special area zones. So that's the downtown riverfront area, the Walnut Station area along Franklin Boulevard, and the high density residential areas to the west of the University of Oregon campus, as well as Chase Village. We also segmented some areas into kind of distinct sub areas with different existing zoning or policy alternatives that we wanted to test. And then we added the area around Valley River Center and the Barger Drive area, which were not identified as suitable CFAs, but have very similar zoning. So with that, I will hand it over to Becky to walk us through the redevelopment analysis.
Thanks, Leah. Hi, Alan. Becky Hewitt, as Leah said, I'm a project director with Echo Northwest. The redevelopment analysis, as Leah mentioned, looks at a pretty wide range of different scales and types of development. We looked at commercial, both kind of more of a storefront, like up to the sidewalk, without its own parking or setbacks, kind of a smaller footprint, kind of infill commercial type of thing, as well as a freestanding, say just a commercial building with a parking lot to the side or behind or wherever. We looked at townhouses, garden apartments, meaning like a 3-story apartment building with some landscaping, maybe some other amenities, as well as what we called kind of compact walk-up apartments, also 3 stories, but just a little bit kind of more of an urban style without a lot of landscaping and maybe pretty minimal parking. And then we looked at 5- and 6-story apartments that would be elevator served, and mixed use buildings between 5 and 7 stories that would have commercial on the ground floor. And we also looked at student oriented housing that would be similar to some of what's been built most recently, kind of close into the university, that's about 12 stories and has units that are kind of designed more for renting individual bedrooms out. So that's the range of things we looked at. You can go to the next slide. Our analysis takes in a number of different factors. It takes in estimated market rents for each of those study areas. It takes in estimated development costs that we've calibrated to local conditions. We look at information about existing property sizes and values, and then current policy about zoning and incentives, and those things all come together to help us understand the redevelopment potential for each sub area. Next slide. So the specific metric we're using to understand financial feasibility is called residual land value. And we don't need to get too bogged down in that. We're not going to walk through all of the charts that were in your packet, but just for you to understand kind of how we're thinking about it. Basically, what it means is that redevelopment is feasible if the cost of building the new thing, including the construction cost and then all the other impact fees and other development costs that it takes to get something completed, are low enough relative to the value of the finished product that a developer could afford to acquire a piece of property for what we think it might be worth at market value. So if they can afford the market value of something that's already developed, and they can afford to tear it down and replace it with the new thing because the value of the new thing is high enough that it's worth it, then that is what we're considering financially feasible redevelopment. So we looked at, there are a number of different factors that are at play here. Leah talked a lot about the regulations. There's also potential for changes to market conditions, but our analysis really focused in on how both the sort of baseline, how much might be feasible, and how financial incentives could potentially change that feasibility. Next slide. So I'm going to step through what we learned about the redevelopment potential in each area. I have a couple of kind of overall developer themes from the developer interviews we did. We spoke to a number of developers that work both in the local area, and then some of them also work more broadly within the Pacific Northwest. So I'm going to share some of the things we heard from developer interviews, and then some of what our analysis suggests in terms of redevelopment potential in each area. Next slide. So what we heard overall from developers, there are a couple of themes that came up across several of the interviews. We heard the importance of amenities in supporting walkable mixed-use development and higher intensity development. We heard that the river is considered an amenity that right now downtown is not considered a really strong amenity. That might be the vision for the area, but that its current condition is not perceived to be an amenity among the development community. That busy major roads are again kind of a disincentive in terms of putting housing next to them. That there's some value in bus rapid transit, but maybe not enough to overcome a lot of other factors. That right now we heard that there's a lot going on in terms of interest rates and other things in the market that are making development pretty difficult in this specific moment. Construction costs are high. I mentioned interest rates, and then construction of condominiums has been a challenge for a while. It's still a challenge due to liability issues. And we also asked people about reducing parking ratios with the city moving away from requiring parking. We asked, would developers potentially consider building new development with very little or potentially no parking? And we heard that even if people are driving less, they are often still at this point going to have a car, and they're going to maybe even be storing it longer because they're driving it less often. So there's still some need for places to store cars. People were concerned about not getting into a situation where the neighborhood really opposed the development, and they were concerned that reducing parking ratios that could put them in that situation. And what we heard was generally, maybe you would need less than one space per apartment unit, but you probably wouldn't go less than half a space per unit. And so that's kind of, when we thought about what form these things would take, we assumed somewhere in that range, generally speaking. Okay, now for each area. So I'm going to start with the downtown core and greater downtown. So the downtown core is on this map, sorry, the colors are different. On this map, the downtown core is that dark purple, and then the greater downtown is the lighter purple color. We heard from the development community some perception issues about people experiencing homelessness and how they felt that affected the desirability to put new construction in this area. And that commercial rents generally are not particularly high. There's some exceptions where there's a sort of special attraction or a special project, but overall, this area, the downtown core in particular, not really seen as a particularly attractive place to invest at the moment. Next slide. So what we saw in our analysis is that because this area, it's pretty intensively developed, so the existing property values are mostly pretty high in the greater downtown area. There are some larger parcels, but most of them are on the smaller side. We did see some limited opportunity for redevelopment on the lower value sites within this area, but not super widespread redevelopment potential. The types of development that from a financial perspective seemed most promising. Potentially some additional student-oriented apartments if you had kind of the right area closer to the university. Even without MUPD, the higher rents that are that those are able to charge because of just the way the business model there and who their market is, that makes them fairly feasible. Higher density multi-unit housing, though, just sort of generally not student specific, is also relatively promising in this area. And then there might be some smaller sites that maybe they're not big enough for a bigger apartment building that might lend themselves to infill with the townhouses. We looked at how much fee assistance could potentially change financial feasibility in this area. And it looked like it would potentially support, we assumed it would apply to essentially everything except student-oriented apartments, just for purposes of analysis. And it looked like it would potentially make a difference for higher density multi-unit housing and mixed use, and might kind of nudge those up a little bit more, maybe support a little bit more redevelopment in that area. Next slide. Within that smaller downtown core, we saw pretty low redevelopment potential. It's still got pretty high property values, smaller parcels, but the market, again, that sort of perception issue about the downtown, a pretty weak market. So pretty challenging to find the combination of lower value site that could be redeveloped and being able to achieve a high enough rent that the value of the finished product would outweigh the costs. Within that area, the thing that came closest to looking feasible was actually just 3-story compact walk-up apartments. This is probably not the vision you have for your downtown, but because those are lower cost in a lower rent area, sometimes they do better. The land costs in this area are so high, though, that it's still very unlikely that you would actually see those as a redevelopment. Fee assistance, it looked from our analysis like it is probably not enough on its own to support redevelopment. If other things changed, if sort of market conditions in that area generally changed, it could help. It did kind of nudge redevelopment a little bit closer to being feasible, especially for higher density projects, but probably not enough to really turn the tide on its own. Next slide. So for 6th and 7th Avenues, for this area, we heard that the street conditions, you know, the wide, busy streets, pretty auto-oriented development made this, again, kind of didn't feel like a really strong area for investment and redevelopment. There's some sense that maybe bus rapid transit is a useful amenity here, but that, again, it might not be enough to kind of overcome the other more auto-oriented conditions on this corridor, at least in the near term. Next slide. So our analysis here suggests, again, pretty low redevelopment potential. There's some mix, some larger, some smaller properties, some higher value, some lower value. So right now the market is pretty weak in this area. If that were to change, there, you know, then maybe there could be some more potential here because there is that kind of range of existing property values and sizes. But current market conditions, not a lot of redevelopment potential. The things that seemed most promising, potentially some commercial infill, maybe some infill townhouses if you found kind of bits and scraps here and there, that kind of smaller properties that might lend themselves to that, or again, that kind of compact 3-story apartment. None of those seeming very likely to happen as redevelopment. They're just the things that are sort of the closest to making sense right now. Looking at incentives such as MUPD or a similarly impactful financial incentive looked like could potentially be enough to make some redevelopment feasible, but still probably mostly at that kind of lower cost, lower density scale, probably still not enough to make things work at a really higher density. Next slide. So West 11th, a little bit of a similar story. Several of these areas, there's kind of like pairs of them that have a similar story. So you'll see that come up a number of times. On West 11th, again, a pretty high traffic, not very walkable. In this area, we also heard that the existing businesses, you know, they're maybe not at a place where they would move on from their locations, they're doing just fine, and that they might not be the kind of businesses that you would want to live right next to in some cases. We heard that actually across the creek kind of canal thing there, that there's maybe more desirability for housing on that side, but that's not in the same zoning and so not considered as part of this area. Next slide. So the redevelopment potential there, again, also pretty low. Some limited opportunities, maybe a few of the lower value sites, something might work. The things that came closest, again, potentially some commercial infill, maybe some infill townhouses, and then 3-story apartments, either kind of more of a garden style, slightly more, you know, slightly lower density, slightly more landscape intensive, or the more compact walk up, kind of depending on the site. Sorry, just real quick on that one. Again, the MUPD or a similar incentive, kind of similar to 6th and 7th Avenues, would have, you know, maybe some impact in terms of making multifamily more feasible, but probably not enough to get into 5- and 6-story development. Okay, now next one. Thanks. So Midtown, this is like a different 2-pack, Midtown and South Willamette. So Midtown, we heard this is a relatively desirable area. It's gotten more popular. There's been some reuse of older buildings, more kind of a stronger retail environment. Next slide. But because it has relatively high existing property values and the parcels are small, that market strength does not necessarily translate into potential for tear down redevelopment. It might translate into potential for like new cool stuff to come in and reuse the spaces, but not necessarily enough to see, you know, a lot of new construction replace existing buildings. Again, the sort of smaller sites might suggest some opportunities for townhouse infill here or there. And if you were to see redevelopment, it would maybe be more likely to be the higher density multi-unit housing comes potentially the closest there. So something like MUPD and incentive along those lines does make the numbers look better for higher density multi-unit housing, but the small sites are still potentially a challenge. So it might be that if you could aggregate enough lower value sites, you could make something work, but the opportunities are still going to be a little bit limited in this area. Next slide. South Willamette, a little bit similar. Heard it was, you know, relatively desirable, relatively higher rent area because of the amenities that are nearby. Next slide. But again, that strong market does not necessarily translate to redevelopment potential because of relatively high property values. There are some larger properties here, so you do have that as opposed to Midtown, but still there are a lot of the lower value, less developed sites are still pretty small. So again, you're kind of in a situation where maybe there's a few pockets that might work for townhouse infill, and if you were to see a bigger redevelopment happen, it might be that higher density multi-unit housing. MUPD or similar incentive could make that a little bit more likely to happen, but kind of a similar story to Midtown here. Next slide. So Lower Coburg Road and Ferry Street Bridge area, we heard that the proximity to the river and to campus, both of those were attractive in terms of supporting investment and higher rents. The roads, which you can see on the map, kind of slice this area up and create a little bit of a barrier to walkable development. We didn't hear that there were a lot of commercial sites that would really be kind of tear down potential, that there could be some challenges with floodplain, but that there might be some potential for additional residential development kind of tucked in here and there around this area. Next slide. Our analysis does kind of agree with that assessment that there's, you know, maybe medium to high redevelopment potential. There are some mixed property values, some larger parcels, and with a relatively strong market. If there are a few lower value sites that are large enough to build a, you know, 5- or 6-story apartment building on, You've seen that happen in this area recently. If there are a few other sites that could support that scale of development, we think there is potential for it. We could also potentially see some mixed use development in this area. And something like MUPD could potentially support, increase the amount of redevelopment potential, increase the number of places where that would work. Next slide. Valley River Center. So again, you've got proximity to the river. You've got a little bit different package of amenities and challenges here, but it does have some similarities. You've got the mall, you've got some big parking lots there, you've got greenway and potentially infrastructure or stormwater challenges, and maybe some regulatory things that could be challenging in this area. You've got some commercial that's doing well, maybe some that isn't doing as well. And so this area is a little bit of a mixed bag. You go to the next slide. Our assessment was that, you know, maybe medium to high redevelopment potential, that so the presence of some larger parcels, the potential for some parking areas to be converted, and you know, what we think is a relatively strong market, that could mean it's kind of, you know, in that vicinity of being able to support some redevelopment. That could range from townhouses up to higher density multi-unit housing. And an incentive could potentially increase the potential, especially for higher density and for mixed use redevelopment, to kind of bump it up from the more townhouse and 3-story end up to a higher, more intensive scale of development. Next slide. So Santa Clara, we heard that the LTD site is going to be an interesting one to watch. We didn't look specifically at that site. There's other plans about that site, but we heard that was going to be, you know, an interesting project. And there are potentially some churches in the area that might have some room to fit some things in, and that the retail rents in this area are relatively strong. Next slide. So redevelopment potential, you know, maybe it's sort of in the maybe zone. There are some lower value, larger parcels. The market is, you know, kind of middle of the road. So maybe some opportunities on lower value sites. I mentioned some of the other things that are, you know, maybe not necessarily going to be, their redevelopment potential is not, we can't quite measure it in the same way. The LTD site, as an example, church properties, those are things that kind of have their own timeline, own process for redevelopment. So there could be some potential through those channels, and then maybe some potential through other redevelopment. We think it's probably more so in kind of the horizontal mixed use zone, some standalone commercial, maybe some townhouses, maybe some 3-story apartments. Not likely right now with current conditions to support taller development, but with something like MUPD could potentially make higher density multi-unit housing more competitive with the other things. So maybe it's kind of in the running for things that could happen through redevelopment. Next slide. Highway 99, we heard a lot of concerns about this area and its redevelopment potential. It's walkable, that it's a busy road. The fact that it's a lower income area just means that the rents that you might be able to achieve in this area are going to be a little bit lower. And so that is, you know, because new construction is expensive, places where your rents are not going to be as high, it's a little bit harder to get to the point where the numbers work in terms of redevelopment. Again, you had some perception issues from the development community associated with people experiencing homelessness, but it was generally not seen as a desirable place for additional housing. Next slide. In our analysis, just given the fact that all of that combined means, you know, your rents are probably relatively low, even though you have some pretty low value existing sites and you have larger parcels, it's a pretty weak market. in places like that, if your market conditions changed, the low existing property values, you know, things can change, but you would really need the surrounding conditions to be different before you could see the market that you would need to support redevelopment in any meaningful way. The things that come closest right now are, again, just some commercial infill and maybe some infill townhouses, kind of you can get a little bit away from the highway. A potential incentive like MUPD was probably not enough to have a really big impact on redevelopment potential. Again, everything else that's going on here is kind of working against that redevelopment potential. And so that financial incentive alone is potentially not enough to change the answer. Next slide. So Barger Drive, this is just a handful of properties. It's a pretty small area, but it's an area you've got some existing commercial that's doing relatively well. The surrounding areas are lower income. So again, it's just going to mean that the rents that you would be able to charge in that area are more aligned with kind of what that existing population in the area could afford. And so although there's potentially some underutilized parking in the area, you know, how much you could turn that into is not totally clear. Next slide. Probably not something where you would see full redevelopment. There's big parcels, but you know, it's probably not a situation where you would be able to like buy it, tear down what's there and replace it with something else. Maybe you could see a little bit of, you know, add another commercial building in the parking lot kind of a thing. Maybe you could carve off a piece to do some compact walk-up apartments. Again, if you kind of found a piece of the site sort of away from the busier roads. But those are kind of more site specific. It would really have to kind of fit in around some of the existing buildings. And again, the financial incentive such as MUPD was not likely to make a big difference. It did kind of nudge potential for apartments a little bit higher, but not probably enough to make a big difference. Next slide. So we kind of put this together, partly because I mentioned there were these kind of pairs of areas that had sort of similar situations. So we wanted to just sort of help you see how this all fits together. The redevelopment potential is kind of a combination of market strength and then how that compares to the value of the existing property. And so places that have a strong market, but most of the property is already pretty high value, are not likely to see a lot of redevelopment. So that's your Midtown, South Willamette kind of area. You might see other things happen, but less likely to see tear down. If you have low value sites, but you have a weak market, again, you're not likely to see a lot of redevelopment. You might see a little bit of lower intensity development if you have a site that's almost basically vacant, but you're not going to see a lot of tear down redevelopment. The ones where you might see that redevelopment happen is where you have kind of a mix. You have some higher value, some lower value properties, and you have a strong enough market that those lower value properties, you could potentially redevelop them and kind of bring them up to the level of intensity of the higher value properties. So overall, we thought the lower Coburg Road, Ferry Street Bridge, maybe Valley River Center, maybe Greater Downtown, those were kind of the three that had the conditions that were most likely to support some redevelopment. And there are others where potentially if the market were to change a little bit, or they're maybe close enough that incentives might make a difference, some of those could potentially move towards having more redevelopment potential if market conditions changed or if the financial incentives changed. For areas with a really strong market, but the sites are already pretty developed, for those to see redevelopment, you would need to see like either a lot of incentive or a lot of change in the market, like an even stronger market. Or there would need to be something where on paper it looks like it's high value, but it's actually kind of falling apart and it doesn't make sense to keep the existing building intact. So that's how kind of these areas compare to one another. We also We have a couple more slides about kind of what this analysis tells us about what it takes to deliver density and mix of uses sort of more broadly, looking across these, what we learn across them all together. Next slide. So what we observed, looking at what generally is making higher density types of development more likely to be financially feasible, generally higher rent areas are going to be better able to support the higher costs that are associated with 5-story or 6-story or taller buildings. So those development costs, as you go up in height, they really only work if it's possible to charge more in rents. The lower cost development types work better where land costs are lower, and also they can still work sometimes where rents are lower. Next slide. So in a lower rent area, when you increase those construction costs to, a 5-story or a 6-story building, that really makes things worse because you're increasing your costs faster than you're increasing your value, and you're just reducing down and down how much you could afford to spend on land in order to do the redevelopment, but you're probably talking about places where land is expensive. So this, in a lower rent area, you're getting further away from the numbers working as the density increases. Next slide. So ground floor retail, it's great for activating spaces. It's great for bringing businesses closer to where people live, but it can be really challenging to deliver because of a combination of the cost of building commercial separated from, but on top or in the same building as residential, and because you've got to have a location that is desirable for both the commercial and the residential. And so those two things make it a little bit trickier. Overall, compared to just building standalone residential, mixed use development is often financially more challenging. There are site-specific situations where that's not true. Like if your ground floor area is going to be particularly undesirable as residential, then maybe it's better off as commercial. Or if you happen to hit the sweet spot where you've got a great location for commercial in a specific area and it's good for residential, maybe that spot works. And sometimes you have no existing amenities nearby, and putting that ground floor commercial in is how you make the whole thing appealing enough to get the rents you need on the residential to make it work. So there are some site-specific situations where it is the thing that makes the most sense, but it has to kind of overcome this challenge that it's increasing the cost, and it may not be, it may or may not be increasing the value depending on what's happening in that specific site. And that's true both in higher rent and lower rent areas, but it's more problematic in the lower rent areas, because at least in the higher rent areas, sometimes the residential piece can kind of cross-subsidize the commercial a little bit and absorb some of those costs. But in a lower rent area, you can't really get away with that. Next slide. So we looked at MUPD as an example of a financial incentive that's available to communities in Oregon. And we looked at something sort of similar to the program you have downtown, just for analysis purposes to give us something to work with. And we haven't accounted for every possible cost associated with providing the public benefits associated with MUPD. So the impacts might vary depending on exactly how a program was structured. But generally speaking, a program like MUPD that offers a full or nearly full property tax exemption for a 10-year period, that's a pretty powerful financial incentive. And so it helps most qualifying residential, depending on what qualifies, but it can make a pretty big difference in feasibility. But in this example, you can see in some cases, it really affects the higher density development, because it's helping close that gap between the costs of development and that net operating income, the difference between the rents you can charge and the operating costs, including property taxes. So it makes those numbers work better. And it means that you don't have to be able to get as much rent to be able to achieve the higher density. Next slide. When we step back to say which of these areas are most likely to be able to support higher density and vertical mixed use, the ones that are closest with the existing policies is probably Greater Downtown and Lower Coburg Road. If you were to provide additional incentives, maybe Midtown or South Willamette, maybe you might get some sites in those areas that could redevelop. And if they did, it would more likely be higher density or vertical mixed use. And then Valley River Center, maybe it can kind of cross that threshold from more of a horizontal mixed use to a higher density potential. Next slide. And then other areas are maybe more candidates for sort of a horizontal mixed use, commercial building next to an apartment building and that kind of thing. So existing policies, places like Santa Clara, Valley River Center, and maybe West 11th might have some potential for some horizontal mixed use. With additional incentives, you could potentially maybe see some of that in 6th or 7th, and maybe with some other investments as well, Highway 99. And next slide, last slide for me, and then I hand it back over to Leah. Thinking about other things you might do besides just financial incentives to support higher intensity mixed use development. Again, a lot of what we heard was about the amenities and what it's like to live in these places and how desirable they are. And so getting right to the heart of that, you know, anything that the city might do that would make that addresses those underlying sort of barriers and perception issues associated with these areas. Maybe that's streetscape improvements or something that makes those roads feel a little friendlier to walk on. Maybe it's the amenities that are nearby. Maybe it's storefront improvements that help bring in new and interesting businesses. And maybe it's providing better bike and pedestrian connections. So all of those types of things can help make these areas more appealing to live in. There are also other financial incentives that we didn't specifically test, but that could potentially be relevant, such as the vertical housing development zone that specifically targets vertical mixed use through property tax abatement, and then system development charge, SDC reductions, or just another tool that's available to the city that could be used for incentivizing targeted types of development. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Leah.
Awesome. Thank you, Becky. That's all super interesting and insightful, and I'm sure it resonates with what folks already know about these different parts of Eugene. So thank you. So I'm going to really quickly try and wrap this all back up and pull these different pieces together. So looking at the evaluation we did through the CFA study and kind of the state's criteria for climate-friendly areas, as well as this kind of more detailed results through the redevelopment analysis, pulled that together to propose 3 options for climate-friendly areas designation. So these kind of build upon each other. The first meets the minimum state requirements and focuses on kind of primarily on Greater Downtown Eugene. The second option is expanded to include some of our core commercial centers that are most promising for CFA-like redevelopment based on the redevelopment analysis, or are already kind of performing with some kind of CFA style development. And the third option is expanded even further to include a couple of our commercial corridors that could benefit from additional investment and financial incentives to see CFA style redevelopment. So I'll work through each of those quickly. So our first option, as I said, is concentrated in the Greater Downtown. It meets our minimum state requirements to the state for accommodating our current and future housing needs. It includes the downtown core, the area around the 5th Street Market. It includes Midtown, as well as some higher density residential areas that are north of 13th Avenue, and then Lower Coburg Road area that you saw in the study. Some of the opportunities that we see for this area, you know, it aligns with the city's priorities for housing downtown. It includes existing and new financial incentives for housing in the downtown core and our urban renewal districts. It's primarily developed as higher density and mixed use. It has high quality active transportation facilities and transit service, with the exception of some needed improvements along Lower Coburg Road. And it's well served by parks and public amenities. Some of the constraints for this area, so we know we'd need to make some land use code and zoning changes, specifically in the small area of high density residential, as well as some possible rezoning downtown. It also concentrates climate friendly areas in just kind of a central area alone, and would likely require expansion of climate friendly areas sooner than the other options, because we're meeting less of our kind of required zoned capacity for our housing need. And then we'll have less development capacity available in these CFAs to use for our land use efficiency measures. Option number 2 expands CFAs to more parts of the city, as I said, including some of the more promising core commercial centers. So these areas are expected to support higher density and mixed use redevelopment, and include all of the areas in option 1, plus the area around Valley River Center, the core commercial part of South Willamette, and then the area around Santa Clara Station. Some of the opportunities we see for this area include that the additional areas are existing core commercial centers, which are highly compliant with CFA criteria. The additional areas are well served by parks and public amenities. And this option extends the CFA tools to more parts of the city, reducing the need to revisit soon. This option includes core commercial centers along several of our kind of key corridors that are targeted for transit improvements, including River Road and Lower Coburg Road. And then some of the constraints for the area. Some of these core commercial centers will still face challenges to redevelopment without additional investment and incentives, as Becky went through. The active transportation facilities and the transit service in some of these additional areas need improvements. And the area around Valley River Center will require some additional analysis, as we did not include it in the CFA study. Finally, the Santa Clara Station area would need to be a secondary CFA in order to maintain the existing building height restrictions there. Finally, option number 3 expands CFAs even further to include 2 of our key transit corridors. That's the 6th and 7th corridor and the West 11th Avenue corridor. These areas are planned as core commercial centers, but as Becky said, they require additional financial investment to improve the safety and comfort for people walking and biking, make them more attractive for housing development, as well as financial incentives to support more high density housing and mixed use development over time. Some of the opportunities for this area, similar to option 2, these are again kind of all zoned similarly. So existing commercial centers, which are highly compliant with CFA criteria. And this option extends the CFA tool even further, reducing our need to revisit anytime soon. This option aligns with some community engagement that supports improvements in these areas, especially the 6th and 7th Avenue corridor. And the additional areas are already well served by existing frequent transit. Some of the constraints, so that these are pretty much strip commercial corridors. And as Becky said, they face some challenges to redevelopment without investment and incentives. They're primarily auto-oriented, so walking and biking facilities would need some significant improvements. And consequently, the additional areas wouldn't, at this point, under current market conditions, support dense mixed-use redevelopment. So tonight, and this is my last slide here, we're looking for your feedback on these 3 options, as well as any changes or additional information that might be useful to inform your recommendation. We're going to City Council in just a couple of weeks with a similar presentation, and then we'll come back to you all in October for your recommendation on a preferred option. At that meeting, we'll also bring you a summary of our first phase of engagement and some key takeaways. We've been doing a lot over the summer that we're excited to share with you. We intend to get direction from City Council before the end of the year on CFA designation. And then in 2025, once the areas have been identified, we'll focus on some of the work to implement CFAs through urban growth strategies that I previewed at the beginning. So that'll include drafting policies in the comprehensive plan related to centers and key corridors more broadly, looking at strategies to mitigate potential housing displacement, completing a multimodal transportation gap analysis in our CFAs, which will consider needed improvements for people walking, biking, and taking transit. And then any changes we would need to make to our existing policies, so the land use code, the comprehensive plan primarily, to get this ready for adoption by City Council in 2026. So with that, we will open it up. I'll stop sharing my screen for your questions, your feedback, and initial thoughts on the options. Yeah, thank you all for your attention during that very long presentation.
Thanks for a great presentation. I'm sure we've got some questions. I know Commissioner Ramey has to leave around 7, so I wanted to give an opportunity if you had something.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And my apologies to the presenters and everyone for having to leave early. These things happen, I suppose. I think I'm very impressed with what I've seen. It touches on a lot of things I was concerned about. It is a tool that does not replace nodal development, but it is a factor of it's a piece of nodal development. So there are still nodes that will develop, and there are different flavors. Maybe that's the way I will look at it. So it's not like we're going to replace these with the existing nodes, and all the work that's gone into that are still there. This is a different kind of node and a different type of node. And I think identifying them then allows us to attract dollars that could be transportation improvements or incentives, as has been talked about, that would make them more feasible for development. As I said, I really like the work. I think it's right in line with what we've been doing for 20 years. It meets our goal. It's flexible, and in particular, I like the idea that we could have an option 1, which does the minimum, but option 2, which then begins to push a little bit further and take advantage of some of those. And I know we were looking for the concept of best fit here to know, and I think somewhere in option 2 is a pretty good fit. Option 3 seems like a bit of a stretch, but maybe this is the time to stretch. So I'm very comfortable with 1 and 2. I love the work you guys have done, particularly happy to see the economic feasibility, the redevelopment. It really, I think, reinforces the direction we've started down. So again, apologies to the presenters and to my co-commissioners, but I will have to be leaving here shortly. And thank you, Chair, for letting me speak.
Does anyone else have a comment? Commissioner Fragola?
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. So if I'm understanding the potential, the redevelopment analysis for potential redevelopment, we were only looking at the density or development component of what we're trying to do for multi-use, mixed-use, walkable neighborhoods, but we didn't include a transportation or multimodal analysis. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe I can start, and Becky, you can add in. So most of the areas we studied, all of the areas primarily, were community commercial, so C2 zoning, which is, as we talked about, is like nearly in compliance with CFA criteria. So we didn't really expect the kind of regulatory changes to change much in terms of redevelopment feasibility. So most of what Becky was testing were current conditions under current or very near CFA kind of development regulations, and then testing it with a powerful financial incentive like MUFTI. So no, we did not test what improvements to transportation would look like in that redevelopment analysis. That will be a next step.
Okay, that's what I thought you said, that there was going to be a multimodal analysis. That would be an additional step. And will that be coming prior to making a decision about the CFAs?
No, so that is a requirement that we'll do next year. So once we actually select at least the general areas we want to pursue, we'll then do the gap analysis and the requirements and the rules are to identify the needed improvements for walking, biking, and transit, and then to prioritize those improvements. So that'll be part of the adoption package and kind of next steps with CFAs, but that won't be until next year.
Okay, so that helps clarify a little bit for me that we're looking for areas to build density where development is possible, and then we would be investing in ensuring that there are walkable areas that encourage multimodal analysis. And the reason I'm asking all of this is because I have to say, I was really surprised to see the Ferry Street Bridge, Coburg, Lower Coburg Road area rate so high, because it's got massive roadways just like 6th and 7th and West 11th, and it's even more chopped up, and it's very difficult to navigate. I mean, you literally have to do loops around things to get from one side of the road to another. So I do have concerns about that area. But I think that if we're looking at it from the perspective of where can we increase density, where is there redevelopment potential, and then we will later decide what we're going to do to make it more walkable, more multimodal. I mean, because that area is it is the complete opposite of pedestrian friendly, complete opposite. So, I appreciate the clarification, and I kind of like the direction that it's going. So I might have a few more questions or thoughts, but I'm glad to pass it to Commissioner Bailing next, if the chair so chooses.
Yeah, Commissioner Bailing.
Thank you. I have kind of an overview question to correct possibly my misunderstanding. I heard in the beginning kind of a definition of redevelopment and the redevelopment analysis dealing with tearing down what's existing and rebuilding. And I wonder, as part of this entire analysis for CFAs and the potential for development, do we not need to consider where there is space for new construction, where there are opportunities for renovation as part of increasing density? Because tear down and building new is not the only architectural and construction methodology available to us, especially where there's these big parking lots with lots of empty space.
Yeah, do you want to take a swing at that, Becky?
Sure. I think there's sort of there's an analysis answer and then there's a bigger answer. The analysis answer is just that understanding the potential for like taking this piece of a parking lot and building something else or renovating the inside of a building is much more nuanced to what is the situation on the ground and how is that parking lot laid out, and then what is the condition of that building and what are the structural needs and lots of things that we don't know. And so it just takes a level of analysis that we can't really do at this scale. So absolutely, yes, those are ways that you can get more of the things you want in the places that you want them. It's just sort of a limitation of what we're able to analyze when we're looking kind of across, hundreds of parcels at a large scale. We can't with any accuracy say this area has more potential for, say, conversion or building on parking lots, et cetera. We can say like this area has more parking lots. This area we talked about Midtown has just sort of anecdotally maybe some potential for things to happen within existing buildings. We just can't really bring any analysis to that. It's kind of more just a qualitative look. But I would say, yes, I agree with you. The redevelopment is just one component of a broader story about how new businesses, new housing, and new investments come into an area. And Leah, I welcome you to add on as well.
Thank you.
That's
Okay,
great.
so transit needs to be included in our bigger picture as we go forward. I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, parking lots are an interesting one. You know, I think the analysis gets at that a little bit because of the existing property value or land value of a parking lot should be evident in the data that we looked at. But they also can be an income stream. And so having a property owner who's willing to take the risk on losing that kind of revenue from a paid parking lot to then do a development is just a tricky space to navigate and kind of look at in this analysis. But Heather, you came off on camera, so I assume you have something to add.
Yeah, I thought I might just let you know that although we're not at this point yet, when we get to the buildable lands inventory, this redevelopment analysis is part of that, because if you didn't look at redevelopment and infill, you'd just be looking at how much capacity your vacant land has. But we know that there is development capacity through redevelopment, which through the buildable lands inventory, we define as tear down and redevelop with a net increase in capacity. And then we also look at infill to the, you know, we haven't gotten there yet, but we will be addressing that. So it just might not be part of this study, but we will be looking at that for both employment lands and residential lands.
I'm gonna throw myself in there maybe and just ask, I saw on the end, there was a mention about SDC exemptions. And I'm curious if that's, you know, worthy of equal consideration in staff's view to MUPTI, or MUPTI seems like the more powerful tool according to the developer interviews and the analysis that was performed. And if there's any reason why one incentive would be preferred over the other.
Go ahead, Becky.
So just from a financial perspective, MUPTI is going to have a much bigger impact on a developer's pro forma in most cases than a system development charge. Exemption, especially if that exemption is focused on, say, one, like just the transportation SDC or something like that, which is, you know, the one that is most likely to be affected by mixed use and being walkable and transit and all these things. And the city already has some exemptions related to the transportation SDC, but just the dollar value that we're talking about, if we're talking about like one system's FDC, is just much smaller than an exemption on most of the property value over 10 years. And Leah, please feel free to add on.
No, that's great. I was just going to add that most of these areas do have an existing adjustment to the transportation SDC for compact development. Everything within a half a mile of a frequent transit would have that. Something that we will look at as a part of the housing production strategy work, which we'll come back to you on, are all of these financial incentives that the city could look at, which could be, you know, expanding MUPTI in the future. It could also be making continued refinements to our SDC adjustments and incentives, and bringing those pieces together to encourage housing production.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking a little bit too about, you know, we were talking about how projects would become more feasible with MUPTI, but I guess I'm curious about how feasible the expansion of that program would be. And obviously it could potentially be really costly.
Yeah, we will see. I don't think we are asking council to like make a decision on that this year by any means, but it's certainly a conversation that I think will be sparked as a part of this work and the housing production strategy work, where we'll be looking at other incentives to encourage housing production in centers and CFAs, but citywide as well.
One little clarification question, and then I don't see anyone else's hand up, but so this year is going to be about providing some direction about which areas to look at further, and then there's going to be some further layers of study, it sounds like.
Yeah, we'd like to get direction on which general areas to pursue, and then we'll need to get into parcel specific boundaries next year. We'll need to do the transportation gap analysis next year. We will need to actually work on the code amendments and the plan amendments to implement the designated areas. So there's quite a bit of technical work we need to prepare in order to be set up for adoption in 2026.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the clarification. Commissioner Beeson?
Thanks. What an abundance of information. Thanks very much to the staff, and thanks, Becky. It's all very fascinating and interesting. I like the way it kind of over the last year or two, all this is kind of built up on a foundation, and everything is pretty well connected, at least for me. I have a few questions. I guess when I go through the whole I understand, I guess, the analysis as I'm thinking about it. The analysis that was done is looking at financial feasibility, market feasibility of redevelopment. And it strikes me when I go through all the slides and I listen to the presentation tonight that my impression is it doesn't look like there's really going to be much significant redevelopment done pretty much anywhere without financial incentives. And I realize that, there is some peers in the greater downtown area. If you swing over into the Coburg Road area, there's a bit, but most of these areas you're looking at, everything is down. It's either down below the line of being feasible, or it's kind of bouncing around in the 10% zone, which appears to be somewhat unlikely. So I'm making that kind of as a comment. I guess I'd ask you to check me on that. It looks like it's pretty hard to do when you're looking for market feasibility. Am I getting the right, without financial incentives? Am I getting the right impression?
Go ahead,
Leah, do you want to?
Oh. No, you can start.
Okay, so I would say yes, and so yes, that is what the places that we looked at and the current market conditions in those places would suggest. If you make multimodal investments in those places, that answer could change. Leah mentioned earlier, and I'm hoping she's going to chime in on this too. Staff intentionally focused on areas where there was a question mark, right? There are places where redevelopment is already happening. They know it is happening. They didn't need us to do math to tell them that redevelopment could happen because developers were already doing it. And so we didn't look at all of those places where things are already happening. And so we're intentionally sort of focusing on the ones that are more like, I don't know, what if we changed some stuff? What if we invested? What if we had a financial incentive? Could this work? And so the fact that most of them, the answer was like, oh, probably not too much, is not all that surprising. And I would say in terms of redevelopment potential, I've done a lot of different redevelopment analysis, and if I saw a place where more than 10% of a relatively large area looked like it could be torn down and replaced, that would be kind of eye-opening. That'd be kind of a lot.
Okay.
If we're talking about a relatively large area. So if sometimes with the places where you see the kind of big redevelopment project, it's usually a public-private partnership. There's a change to the built environment, the transportation network, something that makes it kind of all work. That's not what we modeled. We just looked at kind of, could developers kind of do this on their own right now? if there were a bigger public-private partnership, some of these areas could potentially be transformed in a different way. But I wouldn't have expected to see a lot of places where you haven't seen much redevelopment, but you're right there and developers could just about tear most of it down and replace it. Like, it would be surprising if you saw a lot of redevelopment potential in specifically these places. And Leah, again, I invite you to add on to that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll echo, we didn't look at the downtown riverfront area, the part of this. We didn't look at like Walnut Station along Franklin Boulevard. We didn't look at some of the high density residential areas west of UO campus. Those are all kind of actively developing and redeveloping right now. We see those units coming out of the ground. The other thing that I will just note is something else that Becky and her team are working on are kind of our 20-year estimates for how much capacity we could really expect to see out of these areas in terms of housing units in the next 20 years. That will get fed into our land supply study work that Heather kind of previewed. So what can we realistically expect over the next 20 years in terms of new housing units, new housing capacity in these areas? How does that impact our overall buildable land supply? And having those really realistic numbers around redevelopment so that we're not over assuming what is feasible in some of these areas when we plan, citywide for what we need in the next 20 years.
So a little bit of a follow-up then, and then I'll pass it along. I'm hearing multimodal analysis and some of those kinds of things, which are fascinating. When I went through the slides, I guess this general impression I had for every one of the areas, when you had the descriptor slide that sort of had the kind of observations that I guess developers had made and ETAC had made, and it felt to me, in a general way, like it was sort of a snapshot in August of 2024 of everyone's impression of these areas. And okay, that's all well and good, but I'm looking at, we're doing a 20-year look, and I found myself sort of wondering, well, I'm just not sure how this begins to inform the 20-year view of what we're looking at, because a lot of these areas, I was particularly interested in Valley River. Valley River gets some kind of award for being mentioned the most, but not being kind of part of the analysis. And I found myself wondering, it seemed like its lack of transit, and I read Greenway Challenges, and I was thinking, well, you look at something like Valley River, if there was some change in the transit, it looked like it became an area that was pretty viable. And it felt that way on a lot of things. When I looked at 99 or I looked at West 11th or some of those, 20 years is a long time. So I don't know if my question's making sense. I'm kind of wondering if you do this kind of thing and try to use it to inform your housing capacity analysis or your land capacity analysis, how you might factor in what sort of changes would come from multimodal changes over the next several years. Let me kind of stop there and see if that.
Yeah, we did try to incorporate planned transportation improvements to the extent that we know them. So we looked at like the transportation system plan. We talked to LTD about what their planned improvements are. They're going into their long range mobility planning right now. So they're kind of in the midst of figuring out what that 20-year look looks like for transit service. And to an extent, it kind of follows land use versus the other way around. But Valley River Center wasn't included in the CFA study because it does not currently have frequent transit service. And honestly, that's kind of just a function of where the stop is and all the parking lots that you have to travel through to get to the stop. So you're right, there's certainly opportunities that transportation, the redevelopment analysis really looks at current conditions. The CFA study, we tried to incorporate some of those planned transportation improvements to the extent that we know them. And there in the next 20 years will likely be more changes than we currently know or can imagine right now. And CFAs do really try and make that link between land use and transportation planning to the extent that we can. So
Okay.
I think you're spot on. And there's definitely some things we don't know. And we'll have to revisit climate friendly areas every 8 years as a part of our housing planning work. Every time we do the kind of UGB analysis for housing. So this certainly isn't something we'll only do once and then put away, but we'll have to do a more regular check-in.
Okay. Thanks. Let me pass it along. I do have one more question if we have time, but let me pass it along.
Commissioner Fragala?
Yes, thank you. So I think I am thinking along some similar lines as Commissioner Beeson regarding the Valley River area. So I noticed in my notes that the redevelopment potential for both the Ferry Street Bridge, Lower Coburg area, and the Valley River area was medium high. And with incentives that the Valley River actually moved to high. And there are some pretty unique characteristics there, but if you think of them in terms of connectivity with greater downtown and lower Coburg, there is already connectivity there, right? Like people are traveling constantly, you know, between, I forget what the Country Club Road to go around to connect to the Delta Highway. And then, you know, so that I see a lot of connectivity in those three. So when I look at option one and option two, I guess I personally don't think it's maybe feasible or best choice to push ourselves towards option three, but I think staff and other commissioners have heard me say, I'm very interested in not just meeting our minimum requirements, right? This is an opportunity to move the city forward. It's an opportunity to invest in a vision for planning for our community. And so I want us to stretch a little bit here. I personally would love to see the Valley River area moved into option one. And I'm probably not completely understanding the CFA requirements, but I do really believe that transportation will follow what the conditions are with development. And so I think that will begin to happen. And I'm hearing you say that the multimodal analysis will inform us as to what investments we need to make in that area. So I would want to see Valley River move into option one, but I'm supportive of option two. And I guess when I looked at how the South Willamette area was rated as low, but moving to high with incentives. The same was true of Midtown. It was also rated as low with moving to high with incentives. So I see those two grouped together, and I guess I would put Midtown in option two so that we have these clusters that have, continuity. Because there's continuity again between greater downtown, South Willamette and Midtown, all right? And so we would be looking at these two options that would provide us some opportunities with really kind of taking this opportunity to stretch us a little bit.
Just wanted to note, I don't see any other questions. That I do really agree with Commissioner Fragala. I think that the redevelopment potential in Willamette and Midtown and Valley River Center seem to be really high, and they seem to be like places that people would want to live. I think the analysis was pretty spot on about, some of the challenges that other areas have, and some of those, could be made better over time, but a lot of them have been areas that have struggled for a while. And so I think considering some of those other areas would be really realistic. I don't see any further comments. Oh, you've got your hand up. Sorry, Commissioner Fragala.
Yeah, and sorry, this is really more of a theoretical comment or question. I'm not looking for a response to this. What I am noticing is that a lot of the areas we're talking about already have a significant or moderate amount of economic vitality, but the areas in the city that we have ruled out are those areas that really need us to invest in the economic vitality of the communities. And so perhaps this is not the pathway to do that, but I would want to be asking the question, what is the pathway that is going to do that? Because I don't think we can't neglect those parts of the city. So
Yeah, I know you said you weren't looking for a response, but I think part of why we wanted to frame the beginning of this conversation with this broader centers policy framework in our comprehensive plan is because we recognize that not every area of the city is the right fit in terms of like development regulations and density and intensities as what a climate friendly area is looking at. But we have other tools like neighborhood centers and zoning and policies that could support neighborhood centers that may be a better fit for other parts of the city that don't necessarily have this like high intensity zoning or aren't going to develop at 5, 6, 7 stories right now. And maybe that's not the right kind of context for them, but wanting to introduce that broader framework to say we have other tools, we're going to bring those other tools to you as a part of the comp plan work. And those tools being better fits maybe for other parts of the city. But I appreciate the comment.
Could I chime in just really briefly as well, that just to reiterate that what we looked at was the potential for market rate redevelopment, which again is not the only solution and not the only way to get to your goals. And so I think your point is really well taken, that just because an area does not show a lot of promise for market rate redevelopment doesn't mean it isn't an appropriate place to focus other kinds of attention and other kinds of city programs and investments. So I think that's totally appropriate. It just might not mean that this is the way to get to that more complete community for that place.
And Commissioner Isaacson?
Yeah, I mean, all the comments that I've heard so far are right along with my thinking as well. I know that we haven't addressed this because it's tangential to it, but option 2 encompasses probably the most market rate, highly prized parcels in the city. You put it over by Austin Stadium, it's going to be student housing. So those are going to be $4,000 units, right? You put it over by Valley River Center. Those are wonderful, beautiful views of the river. Those are going to be incredibly expensive units at the end of the day. So my focus is looking at how can we incorporate those, which is great, still units of housing. But at the end of the day, we also want housing that everyone can afford. And so that's the lens that I'm looking at through. So option 3 has more of those options, and that's kind of where I'm leaning towards is either incorporating a few options from the third option into the second, so that we have a mixed bag of opportunities here for development, or option 3 for me.
All right, I guess that is last call for the comments. Thanks, Commissioner Isaacson. We're in our last 10 minutes or so. So I wanted to take an opportunity to look at agenda items from commission and staff and to ask if there's any items or info that commissioners would like to share. And staff?
Absolutely. I always have something to share. I do think Beeson had one more question. Commissioner Beeson, did you have another, like right at the end there, you said you had another one. I don't want to cut you off.
No, you're not. I'm fine. I'll just sort of think about it for a little while, maybe next meeting. It takes me a while to get it sort of gelled.
All right. Well, as you know, you can always follow up with Leah as well. So
I can. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so your next meeting, we've got 2 meetings in September. On the 10th is a work session, and on the 17th is a public hearing, and these are on a package of stormwater code amendments, and you'll be getting more about those soon. So we thought we would do a work session before the public hearing. These are actually coming out of Public Works, so I honestly don't have a ton of information for you tonight. And then right now we've asked you to reserve every Tuesday in October in the event. 3 of those meetings would be related to an appeal of a land use application, and we just hold those in advance. It's one where we think we could get an appeal, and we need to hold those dates because we have some state mandated timelines we have to meet when processing an appeal. So that's why those dates are being held. We'll let you know as soon as we know. We also, on the 8th of October, will be back with climate friendly areas again to talk more about selection. And then at the end of the month, on the 29th, we'll be doing our annual legal training, and that will also be elections for chair and vice chair. And so I'll be reaching out to you about that. All of your meetings in September and October will be virtual, with the exception of we're trying to hold the legal training in person, probably in the same room where we held your retreat. I'll just keep you posted on that. And then in terms of what's coming up at council, climate friendly areas is actually going on September 11th. And then our next planning related work session isn't until October 30th. And that's a work session on voluntary annexations that council has asked for. And I don't have a date yet for when middle housing, when that remand will be going back to council. We're still working on that. We're still working on what that's going to require and what our timeline is. So just keep you in the loop about when that will go. It'll likely be a public hearing at council, just don't know the time frame for that. But in the meantime, we will continue to apply the model code. We're continuing to see middle housing permits come in, and we're continuing to see middle housing land divisions. So thankfully that hasn't slowed down the development of housing. And I think at this point, that's all I have for you, unless you have some questions.
Any questions about any of that? Thank you very much, Alyssa, and thanks to the staff for a really meaty and really interesting presentation. And the meeting of the Planning Commission is now adjourned. Hope everybody has a good rest of your week.
Have a good night.